December 4th, 2020. A routine evening turned into a tragedy that would shake an entire city. Jamal Carter, a 26-year-old man, lay dying just steps from his grandmother's front door. His crime? Walking home. The man who pulled the trigger? Deputy Marcus Gaines, an off-duty officer. A decorated lawman. A man sworn to protect and serve. The initial reports were swift, decisive. Suspect brandished a firearm. Deputy was forced to act. The media ran with it. A police officer faced with an armed threat, a split-second decision. Another tragic, yet seemingly justified shooting. But then, the question started. No body camera footage. No eyewitness accounts backing the deputy's claim. The weapon Gaines swore he saw in Jamal's hand? Found inside the house, untouched. The story the world was told started to crack. The pieces didn't fit. And as investigators pulled at the loose threads, a different narrative emerged, one of betrayal, obsession, and revenge. Jamal Carter wasn't just another victim of police violence. He was a man caught in a deadly game he never even knew he was playing. At the center of it all? Vanessa Gaines. A woman with secrets of her own. The wife of Deputy Marcus Gaines, and Jamal's lover. How did a secret affair ignite a deadly confrontation? What drove a seasoned officer to stalk, ambush, and execute a man under the cover of duty? And how far would he go to cover his tracks? In the days that followed, the walls began to close in on Marcus Gaines. Investigators uncovered a trail of deception, fabricated reports, doctored evidence, a past littered with red flags. And when the truth finally surfaced, it was clear this was never about self-defense. It was a carefully orchestrated murder. Tonight, we unravel the case that shattered a city. A crime driven by jealousy, a web of lies spun by a man desperate to protect his own secrets. A cop who became the very thing he once swore to fight. Jamal Carter was 26 years old. A man with ambitions bigger than the streets of Columbus, Ohio. He spent his days in the kitchen of a small but popular local restaurant, perfecting recipes, dreaming of one day opening a place of his own. To those who knew him, he was full of life, always cracking jokes, always working towards something better. His family described him as a man who took care of those around him, never missing a Sunday dinner at his grandmother's house, always calling to check in on his younger cousins. He wasn't reckless, wasn't the kind of man to start trouble. And yet, on the night of December 4th, he was gunned down in cold blood, left to bleed out on the pavement. The man who pulled the trigger was Marcus Gaines, a name that had commanded both respect and fear in Franklin County law enforcement circles. For years, he had patrolled the streets with a firm hand, known for making quick decisions, known for never backing down. He had built a reputation as a no-nonsense officer, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to act if he believed the situation demanded it. But there were other stories. Stories that never made it to the public. Complaints buried in department files. Excessive force allegations that never led to disciplinary action. Reports of intimidation, of controlling behavior not just with suspects, but in his own home. At the center of it all was Vanessa Gaines. To the outside world, she was the dedicated wife of a respected officer, a woman who lived in a comfortable suburban home, who played the role of a loyal partner to a man sworn to uphold the law. But the reality was much different. Vanessa was a woman trapped, not just in a marriage, but in a life that no longer felt like her own. Marcus Gaines didn't just demand loyalty. He expected obedience. Their marriage was not built on love, but on control. And Vanessa? She had grown tired of it. That was when she met Jamal. It started like most affairs do, by accident. A chance meeting at a lounge on the east side of town. A conversation that turned into something more. Jamal had no idea who she was, and Vanessa never told him. As far as he knew, she was just another woman in search of something different, someone who made her feel alive again. For months, they met in secrecy. Vanessa never let Jamal come to her house, never answered calls when she was home, never gave away too much. And Jamal? He didn't question it. To him, it was simple, two people finding comfort in each other. He had no idea that the man he was sleeping with was Deputy Marcus Gaines' wife. And once Gaines found out, everything changed. Columbus, Ohio, a city known for its bustling downtown, its historic neighborhoods, its quiet suburban enclaves. But within its streets, like in any city, lines were crossed. Affairs happened. Secrets were kept. Some things were ignored. But this was different. This was a line that Marcus Gaines would not allow to be crossed. The call came in at 10:37 p.m. A report of shots fired on Broad Street. Within minutes, patrol cars swarmed the area, red and blue lights flashing against the brick buildings. Officers stepped out, weapons drawn, approaching the scene with caution. But what they found was not the chaotic aftermath of a firefight. There was no shootout, no armed suspect lying in wait. Instead, they found a man, Jamal Carter, sprawled on the pavement, his body riddled with bullets. 6 shots fired. 5 in the back. His keys lay beside him. A sandwich was still clutched in one hand. The entrance to his grandmother's house just steps away. And standing over him was Deputy Marcus Gaines, gun still in hand, breathing heavily as he relayed his version of events over the radio. The first officers on the scene took his words at face value. Gaines was one of their own, a veteran deputy, a man with years of service. If he said the suspect had pointed a weapon, if he said he fired in self-defense, then that was the story. And that story spread fast. Within an hour, local news stations were already running the official police statement. An off-duty deputy was forced to fire his weapon after being threatened by an armed suspect. Authorities say the individual was carrying a firearm and refused multiple commands to drop his weapon. Sources confirm the suspect has a criminal history, though details remain unclear. And just like that, the narrative was set. Jamal Carter became another statistic. A young black man, gunned down by police, with a story that sounded all too familiar. But within that neatly packaged report, there were problems. There was no body camera footage, Gaines hadn't been on duty, and his vehicle lacked a dash cam. The only account of what happened came from the man who pulled the trigger. The supposed firearm that Jamal had been carrying? It wasn't there. No gun was found on his body, not in his pockets, not anywhere near where he had fallen. The only weapon police could find was inside the house, locked away, untouched. A legally owned firearm that had nothing to do with the events of that night. Then came the witnesses. Jamal's grandmother had been inside when she heard the gunshots. She ran to the door, expecting to see some kind of confrontation. Instead, she found her grandson bleeding out on the pavement. She screamed for help. But the moment she tried to approach him, officers blocked her path. She pleaded with them. Told them that Jamal had just left the house to grab food. That he wasn't carrying anything but his dinner and his car keys. That he hadn't even made it to his vehicle before the shots rang out. And she wasn't alone. Neighbors had seen the moments leading up to the shooting. Some had heard voices outside, but not a single witness reported hearing Marcus Gaines issue any kind of verbal warning before opening fire. No demands to stop. No orders to put his hands up. Just gunfire. Then came the biggest question of all. Why was an off-duty deputy following an unarmed man home? The deeper investigators looked, the less sense it made. And the cracks in Marcus Gaines' story were beginning to show. Jamal Carter had always been a man with a plan. He didn't want to spend his life working under someone else. He dreamed of owning his own restaurant, of creating a menu that reflected his roots, Southern flavors with a modern twist. He had been saving every dime, working late nights in the kitchen, picking up extra shifts to make it happen. His friends called him ambitious. His family called him determined. He wasn't perfect, no one is. But Jamal wasn't reckless. He wasn't the type to chase trouble. If anything, he was the kind of man who avoided it altogether. That's why, when he met Vanessa Gaines, he never thought to ask too many questions. She was older than him, confident in a way that drew him in. She carried herself like a woman who had lived a life full of experiences, someone who knew what she wanted. And in the months they spent together, she made it seem like what she wanted was him. Their meetings were always in secret, a dimly lit lounge on the east side of Columbus, a rented apartment she claimed was her own. She never let him pick her up, never invited him over. At first, it didn't seem like much. Some people just like to keep things private. But in reality, Vanessa had everything to lose if the truth ever came out. Because Vanessa Gaines wasn't just some woman looking for an escape. She was the wife of Deputy Marcus Gaines, a man who had spent years upholding the law, but never followed the rules inside his own home. For years, Marcus had cultivated an image of control. He was a veteran deputy, respected in the department. He had a reputation for being tough, for making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. But there was another side to him. A side most people didn't see. There were whispers, stories from suspects who claimed he went too far during arrests, from fellow officers who said he let his emotions dictate his actions. Complaints were filed, but nothing ever stuck. He knew how to manipulate the system, how to make things disappear before they became real problems. And at home, it was worse. Vanessa had spent years walking on eggshells. Marcus wasn't just controlling, he was obsessive. He monitored her calls, tracked her spending, questioned her when she came home late. To the outside world, she was the loyal wife of a dedicated officer. In reality, she was trapped. And when Marcus found out about Jamal, something in him snapped. He wasn't the kind of man to let things go. To him, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was an insult. An embarrassment. A challenge to his authority. And Marcus Gaines didn't lose. In his mind, there was only one way to take back control. Jamal Carter had to be dealt with. Marcus Gaines had always prided himself on control. Control over his household. Control over his job. Control over every aspect of his life. But now, he was losing it. The moment he confirmed Vanessa's affair, he became obsessed. He wasn't just angry, he was consumed by the idea that someone like Jamal Carter could take something from him. That a man with no badge, no authority, no power could step into his world and disrupt the order he had built. So, Gaines did what he did best. He took action. At first, it was just surveillance. He started going through Vanessa's phone when she wasn't looking. Checking her call logs, reading her messages. He traced every conversation, every meeting, every excuse she had given him over the last few months. Then, he shifted his focus to Jamal. It wasn't enough to know that Vanessa had betrayed him. He needed to know everything about the man she had chosen over him. He began following Jamal. Watching him. Studying his movements. Jamal was a man of routine. He worked long shifts at the restaurant, went to the gym every evening, and visited his grandmother's house at least 3 times a week. It wasn't hard to predict where he would be at any given moment. And Gaines was always there. Parked just far enough to remain unseen. Jamal never noticed the dark SUV idling in the parking lot while he was at work. He never noticed the headlights that stayed back just far enough when he left the gym. He never suspected the man sitting across the street, watching him walk into his grandmother's house. But for Gaines, watching wasn't enough. He had to destroy Jamal, not just physically, but in every way possible. He started spreading false reports through the department. Anonymous tips. Claims that Jamal was involved in illegal activity. That he was running drugs through the restaurant. That he was carrying a firearm without a permit. None of it was true. But that didn't matter. Perception was more powerful than reality. Gaines knew exactly how the system worked. He had spent years bending the rules, knowing which buttons to push to get a certain result. And now, he was setting the stage for what was to come. He went further. Fabricating records. He made sure Jamal's name started appearing in internal memos, flagged for possible gang affiliations. He filed unofficial complaints, claiming Jamal had been seen in areas known for drug activity. It was all lies, but on paper, it looked real. And it all led to one final step. The setup. Gaines planted fake intel. A fabricated report that Jamal Carter was armed and dangerous. That he had been seen brandishing a firearm in a recent altercation. That he had made threats toward law enforcement. The kind of report that would justify a deadly encounter. The pieces were in place. The groundwork was laid. And now, all Gaines had to do was wait. December 4th, 2020. A cold night in Columbus, Ohio. A night like any other. For Jamal Carter, it was routine. A quick stop at his grandmother's house for dinner. A few laughs. A warm meal. A familiar place where he always felt safe. He had no way of knowing it would be the last time. By 10:30 p.m., Jamal stepped outside, saying his goodbyes. He jingled his keys in his hand, the sound barely noticeable over the low hum of city life. He wasn't in a rush. He walked toward his car, parked just a few feet away. Across the street, Marcus Gaines sat in an unmarked car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Watching. Waiting. This was it. For weeks, he had planned every detail, every step. He had prepared for this moment. And now, with the weight of a department that trusted him and a fabricated report to back him up, he was ready to execute the final move. As Jamal opened his car door, a sudden flash of red and blue lights filled the street. A siren blared once, just long enough to make Jamal freeze. Confused, he turned around. A police stop? Here? Now? He squinted toward the approaching vehicle, recognizing the silhouette stepping out. A figure he had never expected to see outside of uniform. Marcus Gaines. There was no official police car. No backup. No radioed-in stop. Just a man walking toward him with calculated steps, his gun already drawn. Jamal's confusion turned into alarm. "Yo, what's going on?" No answer. Gaines kept walking, his eyes locked onto Jamal, his grip firm around the weapon. Jamal raised his hands instinctively. He wasn't armed. He wasn't a threat. He had no idea why an off-duty cop, one he barely knew, was standing in front of him, gun pointed straight at his chest. "Hey, man, what?" The first shot tore through his side. Jamal staggered, a sharp pain exploding through his ribs. Then, the second shot. The third. The fourth. His body twisted as he fell to the pavement. He gasped, the cold air burning his lungs. He tried to reach for something, anything, to pull himself up. His vision blurred. The fifth shot hit him in the back. The sixth was the last thing he ever felt. The street was silent again. Jamal's keys had fallen from his hand. The sandwich he had brought with him, untouched, lay beside him. His body was sprawled just feet from his grandmother's front steps. And Marcus Gaines stood over him. Calm. Unshaken. He had done exactly what he had set out to do. But now came the most important part. The cover-up. He bent down, reaching into his own pocket, pulling out a gun, not Jamal's. Not even a weapon Jamal had ever touched. He had brought it with him, ready for this exact moment. He gripped it carefully, making sure not to leave fingerprints, before tossing it inside the house, out of reach, but close enough to fit the lie. Then, he grabbed his radio. His voice steady. Clear. Shots fired. Suspect down. Suspect was armed. Requesting backup. Within minutes, patrol cars flooded the scene. Officers stepped out, their hands already on their holsters, expecting to find the aftermath of a shootout. But there was no shootout. No signs of a struggle. Just a man, lying face down in his own blood, and a cop standing over him, telling a story that wasn't true. As the first officers arrived, they listened to Gaines. He pointed a gun at me. I had no choice. No one questioned it. Not yet. The scene on Broad Street was tense. Officers moved in, securing the area, marking evidence, and questioning anyone nearby. But something felt off. The first responding officers took Marcus Gaines' version of events at face value. He was one of them. A trusted deputy. A man with years of service. His word carried weight. But when homicide investigators arrived, they didn't see what they expected. Gaines claimed Jamal Carter had pointed a gun at him. That he had no choice but to fire. But the evidence at the scene told a different story. The first contradiction? The gun. It wasn't near Jamal's body. It wasn't in his hand. Instead, it was inside the house, several feet away, untouched. The firearm that was supposed to justify this shooting wasn't anywhere Jamal could have reached. The second contradiction? The wounds. Gaines had reported that Jamal had turned toward him, as if preparing to fire. But the bullet wounds said otherwise. Jamal had been shot 5 times in the back. That wasn't the pattern of a shootout. That wasn't the body positioning of a man preparing to attack. That was an execution. The third contradiction? The witnesses. Neighbors who had heard the commotion saw what really happened. Several reported seeing Jamal walking away from Gaines when the shots rang out. One witness later told investigators, "I heard the gunshots. I looked outside, and the man was already on the ground. He never had a chance." Then came the biggest red flag of all. The missing body camera footage. Gaines had been off duty, which meant he wasn't wearing one. There was no official police footage of the encounter. No dash cam. No security footage. Just his word against the evidence. And the evidence wasn't on his side. As investigators dug deeper, the pattern of deception unraveled further. The first thing they uncovered was Gaines' recent search history, a sudden interest in Jamal Carter's life. Phone records revealed he had been tracking Jamal for weeks. Calls were made to known contacts in law enforcement databases, pulling up background information on him. A routine traffic stop 2 months prior? Gaines had looked into it. Jamal's work history? Gaines had searched for it. And then there were the surveillance reports. A local gym owner recognized Gaines from security footage. He had been parked outside more than once, watching from a distance. A restaurant worker came forward, remembering a man sitting in his car near the back entrance, engine running, eyes locked on the front door. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't self-defense. This was a premeditated setup. And Marcus Gaines wasn't the man everyone thought he was. Marcus Gaines had always been a man who knew how to control a situation. He had spent years crafting his image, a disciplined officer, a man who handled pressure, someone who didn't crack. When the call came that detectives wanted to speak with him, he didn't hesitate. He showed up at the precinct with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He walked into the interrogation room, sat down, and folded his arms across his chest. His expression was steady, his voice calm. "I already gave my statement," he said. "I don't know what else there is to discuss." Detectives let him talk. They let him repeat the same story he had told from the start. Jamal Carter had a gun. Jamal Carter was a threat. Jamal Carter left him no choice. For the first 20 minutes, Gaines controlled the room. Then, detectives started laying out the evidence. They started with the gun, the so-called weapon Jamal was holding when he was shot. "We know the firearm you claimed he had was found inside the house," one of them said. "Jamal never had it on him. It was nowhere near him when you fired those shots." Gaines kept his face neutral, but he shifted slightly in his chair. "You don't know that," he countered. "The scene was chaotic. He could have dropped it." "He was shot 5 times in the back," the detective interrupted. "He never had the chance to drop anything." They moved to the witnesses, neighbors who saw Jamal walking away, heard the shots, saw him collapse before Gaines even spoke a word. They brought up the autopsy report, bullet trajectories that proved Jamal was never facing Gaines when he fired. Still, Gaines held his ground. You weren't there. I know what I saw. But then came the breaking point. Detectives slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed logs of his phone records, tracking his calls, his searches, his movements leading up to the shooting. You weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, were you? Gaines remained silent. You searched for Jamal's address. You called in fake reports. You followed him. He shifted again. His jaw tightened. But he still didn't speak. Then, they played the final card, Vanessa. Detectives had brought her in earlier that day. She had been reluctant, hesitant. But when they showed her the evidence, when they told her what Marcus had done, she broke. She confessed. And they had it all on tape. Detectives pressed play. Vanessa's voice was shaky, raw. Marcus told me he would handle Jamal. I didn't know he meant this. Across the table, Gaines finally reacted. He exhaled sharply, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating his next move. He had lost control of the room. But there was still one last piece left to play. They placed a final set of photos in front of him. Security camera stills showing his SUV parked outside Jamal's workplace earlier that evening. More footage from a different location, his vehicle parked a block away from the grandmother's house, waiting. You weren't patrolling. You weren't on duty. You were hunting him. Silence. You planned this, Marcus. And now we have everything we need to prove it. The room was quiet for what felt like minutes. Then, finally, Gaines spoke. I want a lawyer. But it was too late. The door opened, and an officer stepped inside. Marcus Gaines, you're under arrest for the murder of Jamal Carter. For the first time that night, Gaines had no control. He was led out of the room, no longer the respected deputy, no longer the man with the badge, no longer untouchable. He was now a murderer in handcuffs. The trial of Marcus Gaines became one of the most closely watched cases in Columbus. A veteran deputy, a man once trusted to uphold the law, now standing before a judge, facing a charge that threatened to erase everything he had built. From the moment jury selection began, the public's eyes were on the courtroom. News outlets dissected every angle: the murder of an unarmed black man, the abuse of police power, the personal vendetta that led to an execution. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They started with the evidence that couldn't be ignored. The autopsy report, proving Jamal Carter was shot 5 times in the back, not in the front as Gaines had claimed. The ballistic analysis, confirming that every shot had come from a single direction, with no indication of a struggle or return fire. Then came the false police reports Gaines had filed leading up to the murder. Documents were presented showing fabricated intelligence reports, all written by Gaines, painting Jamal as armed and dangerous. Reports that never should have existed. The prosecution outlined his obsessive surveillance, showing GPS tracking data, phone records, and security footage placing Gaines near Jamal's job and home in the days before the killing. And then came the most damning piece of all, the recorded confession of Vanessa Gaines. When Vanessa took the stand, she was visibly shaken. But her testimony was clear. Marcus was unraveling. He kept saying Jamal disrespected him. That he had to put things back in order. That he would take care of it. The prosecution let her words linger. They didn't need to add anything. The jury was listening. Gaines' defense tried to fight back. They painted a different picture, a man acting in self-defense. His attorney argued that Gaines believed his life was in danger. That even though the gun wasn't found near Jamal, Gaines had reason to suspect he was armed. But the argument fell apart piece by piece. The prosecution dismantled it with one simple fact: Gaines wasn't on duty. He had no official reason to be following Jamal that night. He was not responding to a crime, the prosecutor told the jury. He was hunting a man who had no idea he was in danger. And when the jury went into deliberations, they didn't take long. After just 3 hours, they returned to the courtroom. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson stood, unfolded the paper, and read the words that would seal Gaines' fate. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Gaines, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gaines didn't move. He didn't flinch. The judge turned to him, his voice steady as he delivered the sentence. Marcus Gaines, for the premeditated murder of Jamal Carter, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent. And for the first time since the night of the murder, Marcus Gaines no longer had the power. He had lost. The weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom. The air was thick with the realization that justice had finally been served. Marcus Gaines sat motionless at the defense table. His once steady hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened, his breathing shallow. He had walked into this trial believing he could talk his way out, that his badge would still hold power, that the uniform he once wore would shield him. But now, there was nothing left to hide behind. No authority. No control. Two deputies approached, their movements swift, rehearsed. Stand up, one of them ordered. Gaines hesitated for a moment, as if his body refused to accept what was happening. But then, slowly, he rose. His hands were pulled behind his back. The unmistakable click of handcuffs echoed through the room. For years, he had been the one tightening cuffs around the wrists of others. Now, he was the one being restrained. The judge's voice cut through the silence. Marcus Gaines, for the premeditated murder of Jamal Carter, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sharp exhale came from the gallery. A sound of relief. A murmur spread through the room. The reporters wasted no time. Within minutes, the conviction was making headlines. Former deputies sentenced to life in prison for the murder of unarmed black man. Justice for Jamal Carter. Jury finds officer guilty of cold-blooded execution. News anchors replayed the trial's key moments, the prosecutor's closing argument, Vanessa Gaines' damning testimony, the jury delivering the guilty verdict. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some cheered. Some held signs demanding justice for others who never got their day in court. Others simply stood, watching, taking in the moment. Back inside, Marcus Gaines was escorted toward the door. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at the people who had once respected him. He kept his eyes ahead, his expression unreadable. But this time, there was no escape. No badge to flash. No department to back him. No fabricated reports to cover his tracks. For the first time in his life, Marcus Gaines was powerless. For weeks after the trial, Vanessa Gaines remained silent. She refused interviews, ignored calls from reporters, and disappeared from public view. But when she finally spoke, her words painted a picture even darker than anyone had imagined. In a recorded statement given to investigators, she described the final days leading up to the murder. Marcus wasn't sleeping. He was barely eating. He kept watching Jamal's social media, looking up his schedule, figuring out where he would be. He was obsessed. He kept saying Jamal disrespected him, that he made him look weak. That something had to be done. Vanessa described the moment she realized her husband was losing control. One night, I woke up and found him sitting in the dark, just staring at his gun on the table. I asked him what he was doing, and he just looked at me and said, "You don't need to worry about Jamal anymore." The weight of her words hung heavy. She had known. She hadn't understood how far Marcus would go, but she knew he was planning something. And then, there was the final piece of evidence, the messages investigators found buried in Gaines' phone. Hundreds of texts, deleted but recovered by forensic specialists. Messages sent to an unknown number. One stood out. Jamal took what was mine. He won't get away with it. The timestamp? The night before the murder. And another, sent just hours before Gaines pulled the trigger. Tonight, it ends. There was no self-defense. No sudden moment of fear. There was only premeditation. A decision made long before Gaines ever pulled the trigger. The final image from that night still lingers. Jamal's last meal still lying on the pavement, untouched. The bloodstained concrete, darkened by the cold December air. And then, the courtroom. Empty now. Silent. The trial was over. The verdict had been read. But the stain of what happened on Broad Street would never fade. In the end, Marcus Gaines lost everything to his obsession. His badge, his freedom, his carefully crafted image, all gone. But one question remains. Was Vanessa truly innocent? She had lived under Marcus' control for years. She had feared him, watched him unravel, seen the warning signs. But she never stopped him. Never warned Jamal. Never spoke up until it was too late. So was she just another victim? Or was she part of the game all along? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. For more crime stories, make sure to check out our channel, where the truth is always darker than fiction.